So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second Dean's Forum on the Future of the University of California. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a minute, but I'm just going to make a few prefatory remarks about the nature of the forum. My name is Mark Richards. I'm the Executive Dean for the College of Letters and Science. A number of months ago, back when we thought that the state would be providing 12% of our budget instead of just 10%, this was last May, a number of the deans decided that it would be a good idea, in the face of likely major tuition increases and disinvestment in public education, to convene a series of fora, among other activities, to consider the future of higher education, the public character of public education, and the present predicament. The present predicament is really unprecedented in most of our lifetimes. The entire social contract of not only this nation, but of nations around the world is being called into question and wrestled with on an epic scale. My own personal take on this is the following. My parents' generation provided rather well for their children's generation in terms of public education. However, this generation is not doing so and is providing well for themselves, perhaps in terms of entitlement, but the epic disinvestment, particularly in public education and public higher education, is jeopardizing our children's future and jeopardizing this great university that we all love so well. So the purpose of the forum is quite simple. We want to figure out what we're going to do about this. We want to talk about the issues, to educate ourselves, and to hear many different voices and ideas on how to move forward and how to rebuild our great public university. The format today is that we have 5 distinguished speakers whom I am going to discipline to about 7 minutes each. And they're going to give their thoughts on a range of issues. The title of today's forum, I have here somewhere, it's quite long. Taxation, Citizenship, Protest, and the Current Crisis in Higher Education. The next 2 fora will involve one probably this winter on the economics of higher education, and probably in the spring, the public character of public universities. All of these things, of course, are highly intertwined. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. We're going to hear from them briefly, and then we're going to invite questions. In fact, I'm going to start now by inviting questions, because the way we're going to do the questions is to ask you to write your questions in 1 sentence or less on a card that has been, I think all of you have received cards. We'd like for you to identify yourself by name in legible writing, and also tell us whether you're a student or a faculty member, undergraduate student, graduate student, faculty member, staff member, or whatever. And then our friends at the ASUC and the Graduate Assembly, represented by Vishali Lumba and Philippe Marchand, are going to sort these questions, and they will be calling out your name and asking you to come forward to the microphones arranged here to read your own question, so we hear that question in your own voice. And we want to do this in as efficient and respectful way as possible, so that we have as many questions and as much dialogue as we possibly can. Needless to say, I think everybody in this room is passionate about these issues. We want to have both a passionate and a very civilized and respectful conversation. I'm sure we're all up to that. So let me introduce the speakers. I'm going to introduce all 5 of them in the order in which they're going to speak, and then I'm going to turn them loose. Our first speaker will be Dean Henry Brady. He's the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy and the co-author of the forthcoming book, The Unheavenly Chorus, Unequal Political Voice, and the Broken Promise of American Democracy. Our second speaker will be Alfredo Mireles. He is the student regent on our UC Regents. He is a Berkeley alum. He's a graduate student in health policy at UCSF and is a registered nurse. Our third speaker will be Professor Katherine Cole from the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance and a scholar of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Our fourth speaker will be Jonathan Stein. He is the student regent-elect. He is a Berkeley student in the School of Public Policy and the Law School, pursuing both an MPP and a JD here at Berkeley. And our fifth speaker, you may all be surprised, is Professor Donald Kennedy, who is the President Emeritus of Stanford University and the Bing Professor of Environmental Science Policy at Stanford University. We will be trying to bury the axe today. I have to say that if someone had asked any of us 5 years ago whether or not it would ever be more affordable for the great middle class of California to attend Stanford than the UC system, we would have all laughed. This day is dawning, and we very much appreciate Professor Kennedy joining us today. So I'm going to let Dean Brady start off.
Thanks, Mark. I'm deeply honored to be here today with such a distinguished group of panelists and to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. As Mark mentioned, I'm just finishing a book on this topic, and I care deeply about it given my personal history and also the fact that I've devoted a large amount of my research over the years to exactly this kind of issue. I'm going to talk about three things very quickly. Class and age divisions in American society, disinvestment in higher education, and higher education as a public good. This first slide shows you what we've done here is we look at SES, socioeconomic status quintiles. In other words, we look at basically different income groups, but also different education groups. We combine a measure of education and income into one measure, and then we break it up into 5 groups. Those who are poor with low education on the left, those who are rich with high education on the right. And what you find is in answer to a question on the American National Election Studies in 2008, it's maybe not a big surprise, but the people who have money, who have high education, are much less favorable towards the notion that the government should guarantee a job and make sure that everybody has a job and a good standard of living. So there's a big difference across class lines in America with respect to a very fundamental issue about jobs. Furthermore, high SES people vote more. So the folks who don't think that jobs are such a problem vote more and obviously have a big impact on American politics. There's another way you can look at this kind of data is let's just look at particular kinds of acts like giving money to politics, going to political meetings, or working for campaigns. And here we don't have quintiles, that is to say 5 groups, we look at percentiles. So now we're dealing with the 1% versus the 99%. The 1% is the far right on this diagram. And you might notice they give a lot of money to politics. In fact, this isn't even the amount, it's whether they give money to politics. If you start looking at the amount of money they give to politics, they give an enormous amount of money to politics. So they're more likely to give, they give a lot of money. They're also more likely to go to political meetings or to work in campaigns. So this means that American politics is shaped to a very large degree by the 1%, the top 20%, the folks at the top of the income hierarchy, the folks with the most education. And those folks, as I've just shown you, aren't as concerned about jobs as other people. Young and old also is another basic cleavage in American politics. They want different things. The young are much more likely to support funding for higher education. The old are much more likely to support no changes in Social Security. This is what Mark was talking about support for higher education and whether or not older people today are paying taxes to support higher education. And the answer is they're not so willing to do that because they have other priorities, namely keeping Social Security intact. Furthermore, the young don't vote as much as the old. This shows you both registration and voting using census data, and on the left you can see the young people are much less likely to vote. Then as you go across the diagram to higher age groups, you get increasing amount of voting until you get to the very, very highest age groups when it falls off a bit. So, what do the young and the poor have left? The young and the poor have left the weapon of the weak, which is protest. And this is some diagram from data from 1991 that I had at hand, which just shows you the percentage of people protesting by age group. You get a similar kind of result if you look at income group, although there it's not so pronounced, because the truth is people in lower income groups protest more than you'd expect, but they still don't protest as much as people in higher income groups, because it's hard when you've got a low income, you're worried about taking care of your family and doing all the daily necessities of life to get out and protest. But nevertheless, protest is the weapon of the weak, and that's the way the young and the dispossessed in this society get a voice. That's what Occupy Wall Street's about. That's what Occupy Cal is about, I think. Okay, so the conclusions are obvious. Classes matter in American politics. Age matters in American politics. Young and old people have different preferences. Different classes have different preferences. And furthermore, they reinforce one another, these differences. Disinvestment in higher education. This diagram shows you that the peak state investment in higher education was around 1980 in America, and it's just fallen off ever since. And by the way, this only goes to 2009. If we went all the way to 2011, it would show even more disinvestment. And then the next slide shows you where California is in this up to 2010. And again, if we went to 2011, we'd see even California being more disinvestment in higher education. So this is the amount of disinvestment. Every state has disinvested. California is very high. The longer the bar, the more disinvestment. California is way, way up there. That's the background against which the protests are occurring, against which we see what's happening in America right now. But should the public invest in higher education? Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it's a private good, just something that we should pay for on our own. Well, in 2005, Mike Hout, John Stiles, and I wrote a study in which we showed that for every dollar invested in higher education, the state gets $4 in benefits for those who go to community colleges, CSUs, or UCs. That doesn't even count the benefits to society from research, better arts and culture, and all the other things that higher education does. So benefits produced by higher education for students, higher lifetime incomes, more tolerant people, more social capital, enhanced social networks, all sorts of benefits. Right now, we have the largest disparity in lifetime income between those who get a higher education and those who don't that we've had in America ever. Getting a higher education means a lot. Not allowing people to get a higher education means a lot too. It means lots of people don't have the opportunity to realize their dreams. And for society, higher education produces great research, culture and arts, and all the other things I mentioned. So the public sector should invest in higher education. It makes sense for the public sector to do so. It provides opportunity for folks throughout the income spectrum, and our increasing disinvestment in higher education is a tragedy for which something has to be done. And I personally thank the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Cal people for changing the conversation so that we're not now talking just about budget problems, budget deficits and the debt, which is a long-term problem, but instead we're talking about the short-term problem, which is jobs in America and investing in a whole lot of things, including, and maybe especially, higher education. Thanks.
Thanks, Henry. Before Alfredo speaks, I just want to remind everyone that if you pass your question cards toward an aisle, our students will collect them. Okay, Alfredo?
How's everybody doing? Thanks for coming out today. I want to say hello. My name is Alfredo Mireles. I'm the current UC student regent, and I'm incredibly happy to be back at Berkeley. I'm super happy that I'm not worried about finals here. Walking through Wheeler to come to this event definitely brought back some, I would say, kind of painful memories. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to a fantastic discussion between the panelists and the audience. So things have clearly been challenging here at Berkeley and the University of California and for the last couple of years. But before we address the challenges, I think we should remind ourselves why we want to fight so hard to preserve what we have. On a personal level, I wanted to go to nowhere else but Berkeley. And as an undergraduate, and I was a community college transfer student, and I come from a family where nobody had a 4-year degree. In fact, my father came to this country from rural Mexico, where he's only able to go to 6th grade. So the fact that I had the absolute privilege to spend some of my most formative years here at Berkeley is something I'll always be grateful for. And moreover, why I've chosen to fight for this university to allow others to have the same opportunities I've had. So also, by all known metrics, UC Berkeley specifically, but the University of California as a whole, continue to be paragons of public higher education. So since we're talking about taxes and the economy, let me give some statistics that I think, something we can use to try to influence the state legislature. There was recently a report commissioned by the regents and about the economic impact of the University of California, and it found that the UC contributes $46.3 billion in annual economic activity. It contributes $32.8 billion towards California's gross state product. For every $1 that the state invests, the UC yields $14 in economic input or output. And 1 in 46 jobs in California is supported directly or indirectly by the UC. However, we all know that the University of California is facing tremendous challenges today, and that's why we're here to talk about. From the student perspective, the two most obvious examples are the recent incidents of police violence on our campuses and the never-ending cuts made by the state government to our campuses. I'm sure many of you were at Sproul Plaza on November 9th when peaceful protesters were assaulted by police. A close friend of mine that I went to Berkeley with, who's a grad student here now, was one of those protesters. Her name is Logan Harris, and I've seen the bruises on her arm. Equally appalling was the use of pepper spray at UC Davis on November 18th. I actually had the chance to talk to some of the student protesters there, and one young man named Ian Lee was an 18-year-old freshman in his first quarter of college, whose life will be forever changed. So, changing gears, frustrating in a different way, are the cuts that we've seen by the state. So since 2007, 2008, assuming the governor's trigger cuts do happen, which in all likelihood they will, the UC will have seen a loss in $1 billion over the course of 5 years from state funding, which is about 1/3 of our overall state appropriation that funds the education of students here at the UC. Both of these situations are tragic, but thankfully I see some changes taking place that give me some hope. First, let's talk about the incidents of police violence. I know of at least 5 commissions and investigations going on that these incidents have spawned that will hopefully lead to justice for the students that were assaulted. First, there's the individual campus-based investigations. Second, the University of California Office of the President is convening all 10 chancellors to come up with best practices for dealing with peaceful protests. Third, there's an independent commission that's been commissioned by President Yudof. Fourth, in 2 weeks, there's a hearing at the state capitol commissioned by the Speaker of the Assembly. And fifth, there's the Yolo County District Attorney / potentially California State Attorney General that may be looking into this situation as well. So with multiple groups looking into these horrible situations, my desire is that the people who made the decision to use force at Berkeley and Davis will be fired, and campuses will finally have policies in place on how to deal with peaceful protests. The state budget situation continues to be a vexing issue with some potential hope as well. Systematic problems still exist. And with the ending of the temporary taxes at the end of this year, the Legislative Analyst's Office projects that California will have a $13 billion budget deficit in 2012 to deal with. But as many of you heard yesterday, the governor unveiled his tax proposal that calls for temporary tax increases on the state's highest earners and a 1/2 cent sales tax. He's not the only person leading the way for new state revenue. The Think Long Committee, which is comprised of billionaires and former governors and others, has proposed a tax plan that would reduce personal and corporate income tax, as well as place a tax on services like attorney services or accounting services. And they project that it'll bring in $10 billion for the state. So far, the Think Long Committee is the only one that has said that the revenue will go to higher education. I think all of us are a little uncertain about precisely what the governor is going to do. I think we all had the same reaction. It didn't explicitly say just K through 12, but that's how it was perceived by many. There may be other tax measures on the November 2012 ballot as well. Presidential elections usually bring a more Democratic electorate that are more willing to vote for new revenues. So where does that leave us? So I still believe, despite all the problems, that we need to fight to preserve UC Berkeley and the UC system. Both have given everybody in this room a lot, and it would be immoral to not grant the same opportunities to future generations. So, however, no easy answers exist, but I believe it's the responsibility of everyone in this room to find ways to advocate for safer campuses so students can freely express themselves, and for more state funding so we can finally end the state divestment from higher education. So with that, I want to again say thank you to everybody who came today. I look forward to a robust discussion with the panelists and the audience, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Good afternoon. What I really want to talk to you about today is the future of public higher education. How many people in this room are students? Could you raise your hands? And staff? And faculty? How many are citizens of the state of California? Citizens, I ask you, whose university is this? Let's try that again. Citizens, I ask you, whose university is this? Okay, better. We all know about the current financial problems of higher education in California, the deficits, the shortfalls, the budget cuts, the retrenchments. We have all heard about the 30-year starvation diet imposed by Proposition 13 and the stranglehold of California's 2/3 majority legislative process. We are all suffering from the dysfunctions of an economic and governmental system that has essentially put our great institution on life support. What I really want to say today is that we must not let our financial troubles circumscribe our imagination or limit our ambition. We may lack money, but the University of California has a vast, underutilized repository of wealth. The ingenuity, creativity, determination, intelligence, innovation, activism, loyalty, and goodwill of our university's citizens. There are at least as many bright possible futures for the University of California as there are seats in this room. I'm in the arts and I conduct research in Africa. Both Africa and the arts pretty much never have money. But artists and many people living in Africa do not let lack of resources limit their ambitions or imagination. We think big, we think innovatively, we think collaboratively. We envision the future we want, and then we find the resources to make that vision happen. Last year, the UC Regents Commission on the Future told us in its final report that, quote, "the future cannot be avoided." What I want to convey today is a very different message. The future of public universities in America must be invented. We have inherited what previous generations of Californians have created for us. The university was built through their taxes, their ingenuity, their curricula, their books, their buildings and ideas. We have inherited a precious resource. It is a public good. We are its stewards. But we must do more than protect and preserve. Traditions that don't change die. One key inheritance of ours is the 1960 Master Plan of Higher Education in California. Many would consider this one of the most important documents of higher education in the 20th century. Among the things we associate with the Master Plan are education for all rather than just the elite, the majority of funding coming from the state, and free tuition. Those are all good things, but in 50 years, much has changed. Few of the assumptions behind the master plan are still true today. Please note, this document was called a master plan, not the master plan, and it was meant to only last 15 years. Citizens, it's time to redesign public higher education. In thinking of a new blueprint for higher education for the citizens of California, we must look critically at our past. This is the image that Time magazine ran in 1960 for its cover story on California's master plan. The man in the foreground is Clark Kerr, the UC president who is credited as its architect. But take a look at the background. What is happening to those students as they pass through Sather Gate? Our California system of mass education was designed to be an engine of equality. It functioned as that for many years, but at what cost? What happened to students in the process? We see in this image the conditions that gave rise to Mario Savio's cry 4 years later in 1964 when he said, "We're human beings." Students are not raw materials, and we might add, students are not invasive plants to be sprayed. They are human beings. Today, I want to invite us to ask this question. If we were to design today from scratch a university for the public good in California, would it look like the UC as we know it? I suspect the answer would be, in some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. We need a new social contract with the people of the state of California. We need to give them compelling reasons to reinvest in us. People like to invest in innovation, so citizens, let's innovate. Today, just for a moment, let's imagine a long horizon. Let's dare to venture an expansive vision. How do we see our future? How do we picture it? By what process could we, the people in this room, begin to imagine a brighter, better future for higher education as a public good? To look at the University of California is to look at California itself, its land, its people, and their problems, into the civilization rushing towards us from the future. There are few aspects of California with which the university is not concerned. That's a quote from two artists who were hired in the 1960s to picture the future of the University of California. One was a photographer, the other a writer, and they were asked to imagine as much as possible the next 100 years. We are now 50 years into that future. Did they picture us? Here is one of these artists, Ansel Adams. He was hired by the UC Regents to take 1,000 images of the whole UC system between 1963 and 67. Instead, he took 6,700 images, all of which we own. This is one of my favorites. Ansel is looking inside the camera. He's looking at us. We are the future. Adams and his collaborator, writer Nancy Newhall, dedicated their project called Fiat Lux to, quote, those who will make the future. These artists understood that the future must be made. I really wanted to talk to you today about the future, about how we must envision success in order to be successful, about how we must imagine our institution anew in order to renew our social contract with the people of California, about how one has to rehearse a better future in order to bring it into being. But I have a dilemma. I find it very hard to talk about the future when the fabric of the present has been so systematically torn by repeated violence at our university over the last 2 years. Violence unmakes things. I cannot talk about making a future when the present has been unmade. I cannot talk about citizenship when our own institution so consistently disrespects the rights of its citizens. Violence gives us no horizons. It makes the future recede as we all become myopically fixated on the present. I recently wrote a book about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. A key concept from the commission is Ubuntu, a Zulu concept that says a person becomes a person through other people, which is to say, I realize my humanity when I recognize your humanity. If I attack you, I also become less human in the process. Our institution, the University of California, has been attacking people. It has been attacking its own citizens, and we have all been dehumanized in that process. Until we restore our humanity, we cannot talk about the future. Citizens, I ask you, whose university? Our university. Citizens, I ask you, whose violence?
Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to sit. I'm more comfortable that way. Anyone object? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Thank you, Alfredo. My name is Jonathan Stein. I'm the student Regent-Designate and a graduate student here at UC Berkeley. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much for coming out. And to the students who are dealing with finals right now, it's really a treat to see you in the audience. So Alfredo and I went on a campus tour over the course of the fall semester, which nearly drove me to drop out of law school. It took up so much time. But the point was that we wanted to take financial information about the UC and about our budget deficit and about the potential for raising fees in order to fill that budget deficit to all the student governments on all the UC campuses. And one question that we got time and time again was, what can we do? What is most effective? Students would say, you know, I don't have a lot of time. I want to be effective with the way I do my activism. What should we do? And the response that I always gave was, you should do whatever you're comfortable with. It doesn't matter if protest is the most important thing you could do or the most effective thing you could do. If you're not comfortable with protest, it's not going to matter. It doesn't matter if lobbying is the most important thing you can do. If you're not comfortable putting on a suit and going and lobbying, then it doesn't matter. So really what you should do is whatever drives you, whatever gets you out of your seat and gets you active. And luckily, an effective student movement requires students doing the best that they can do in a number of different capacities. It requires students who are willing to protest on campus, students who are willing to protest at Regents meetings, students who are willing to protest in Sacramento, and students who are willing to lobby on campus and lobby the Regents and lobby in Sacramento, and it requires students who are willing to run the student newspaper and write op-eds, and students who are willing to run for student government and run our student governments, and even students who are willing to be student regents and work for what they can achieve within the system. And it was my view that only with students doing all of these things could a student movement be effective. And while the students who are occupying Sproul might look very different than the students who put on a suit and lobby in Sacramento, that they need each other. The mass actions on Sproul generate attention and generate heat and generate pressure on the administration or on Sacramento that the students who are willing to put on suits can then use by working within the system. And so without the students' intents, the students with suits cannot be effective, and vice versa. And as long as everyone can respect the fact that other people make different choices and how they do their activism and their organizing, we could all get along and we could all do the best that we could. And I'm realizing now increasingly that I left something out that was really important and that I wish I had remembered. And that's that increasingly I think what students need to be doing is taking the crisis in public higher education to their parents. The near-term fate of this university, in my view, rests in those ballot initiatives on the 2012 ballot. But those ballot initiatives are more than just about the university. They're about fundamentally a choice about what kind of state we want to be. So in public finance and public policy, Dean Brady, apologies to you, you were the one who introduced me to this. There are two models of public finance, the California model on the one hand and the Mississippi model on the other. And if I get any of this wrong, please correct me. But the California model is you say, okay, we're going to have sort of modest to high taxes, and with that tax money, we're going to generate high quality public services, a really good K-12 system, public higher education. We're going to pump out highly skilled workers. We're going to drive innovation and entrepreneurship, and we're going to generate wealth. And we're going to tax that wealth. And using that tax money, we're going to provide high quality public services like a good K through 12 system and quality higher education, and we're going to drive even more highly skilled workers, and we're going to drive even more innovation, we're going to generate even more wealth, and it's a spiral that goes upward. And the Mississippi model, on the other hand, is you say you keep taxes low, you cannot provide any high quality public services, you don't have a good K through 12 system, you don't have a high quality public education system, higher public education system, and you don't generate wealth, you don't attract industry, but after all, you keep your taxes low. And so you have a spiral that moves downwards. And it was called the California model once upon a time because we were standard bearers here in this state of a robust public finance, of robust public investment, of a robust state government. We were an example of what government could do when it was working well, right? So when Jerry Brown's father was governor, we had these big, bold ideas that were examples for the rest of the nation to follow. We built the greatest highway system in the world, in the country. We built a water system that was the envy of the country. We built the best K through 12 system in the country. And the gem, the crowning achievement was the master plan, right? So we had the ambition to envision the greatest system of public universities anywhere in the country, if not the world. And moreover, we had the ambition to make them free, or to at least conceive of them as being free to any student who wanted to attend, accessible to the top one-eighth of high school graduates, and as diverse as the state of California more generally. And moreover, we had the willingness to sacrifice to make that a reality. We went out, we built some new campuses, we reinvigorated the ones that we already had, we grouped them together, and we pulled them into a cohesive system that ended up being the greatest system of public universities anywhere in the country, if not the world. And for 50 years, that choice drove our economy and it drove our prosperity. It turned California into what it is, or what it was a couple years ago. And that's why I say that California was a model for what it can be, what a society can be with a well-functioning state government, with a bold vision, with taxpayers willing to tax themselves in order to fund it, and a series of choices about investments, about investing in ourselves and about investing in our future. So the master plan and the UC, in my view, are exhibit A in why progressives ought to be in charge. They are exhibit A. For what state government can do, what a society can achieve if it decides it wants to come together and invest in itself. So right now, we don't look like the state that wants to have the California model of public finance named after it anymore. It's a 30-year trend. It started with Prop 13, which has been mentioned today shockingly few times, given its role in all of this. But it's gotten particularly bad in the last decade, right? So the state in 2003 was about 50 to 60% of UC Berkeley's funding. Today it's about 10 or 11%. At that time, California was the primary source of funds for UC Berkeley. Today it's fourth, behind the federal government, student fees, and private philanthropy. So in November, we have a choice about whether we want to continue state divestment from public higher education, a choice about whether we want to continue to privatize the University of California. But more generally, we have a choice about what kind of state we want to be. And if we want to be the state of the last few years, or if we want to be the state 50 years ago that made choices to make California the greatest state in the country. So I return to the original question, what's the most effective way to do our advocacy? I think it's important that we continue to protest. I think it's important that we take our message to Sacramento. I think it's important that we lobby. I think it's important that we do all the things that we're doing. But I think it's really important that we do good old one-on-one retail politics. I think it's really important that students go home over the winter break. They talk to every individual family member they can about our public priorities and whether or not they're important to us and whether or not we want to continue to retreat from them, or if we want to make a different choice and we want to reinvigorate this university in a way that can benefit this state for another 50 years. So what I'm proposing is a statewide teach-in, a Christmas break teach-in with students doing the teaching. Thank you.
I'm Don Kennedy, and even though I'm from Stanford, I had no hesitation in answering the question that Professor Cole just raised by saying, the University of California is my university. And I want to make a point about why it is, to get the Occupy movement and the Cal occupants to agree on a lot of things, beginning with Professor Cole's inspiring point that there are huge resources here and that they will, building on those resources, do a terrific job. But to add the point that they and all of us need help in making that happen. In what I have to say in the next, I'm getting down to what? 7 point something minutes? No, 6.8 minutes. I want to talk first of all about the 99 and 1 issue, because it refers to a disparity that is horribly interrelated with the problems for the university that we are going to discuss, but also that it's even worse than that, because as Paul Krugman and other economists have evaluated it, the big difference is really between the 0.1% and the 99.9%, a distinction that some wag has called the distinction between the dirty rich and the filthy rich. That's a problem, all right, but it is by no means the root of all problems for the university. Economists are scurrying around now to try to discover what is going wrong with that particular disparity. They will attribute some of it to globalization, which increases the wage gap between skilled workers and less skilled workers. That's a real problem for both groups, but perhaps particularly for Cal students who expect something good to happen to them on graduation from a great university, but who will encounter a labor market with a higher than usual unemployment rate, where every percentage point of increase in that rate drops the wage rate for new graduates by 6%. That's dismaying leverage. But those differences aren't the only ones that are important here. It is the even larger disparity involving budgets as well as endowments between the public, that is, the state-supported universities, and the well-endowed private institutions, like the one I went to and like the one I've taught in for almost 60 years. At the bottom line, in California and elsewhere, state budgets for higher education have been squeezed to a point at which they're ill-equipped to meet the needs of the students that are enrolled in them. That's not a small problem, because it's shared by all students who are now being educated in these places, and 3/4 of all US students are now being educated in those great public universities. Before I turn further to the numbers and look around for a solution or two, I want to share a little piece of history. When I came to Stanford in 1960, something my colleagues and I occasionally talked about was that Stanford needed Cal and Cal needed Stanford. It's an interesting and fruitful competition for both institutions. There may have been a kind of suburban myth about a no-rating strategy between Stanford and Cal. I never was able to really confirm that. In any case, it's been violated frequently these days with impunity. But back in the 60s, a friend of mine on the Stanford Library Committee actually persuaded a colleague of his on that committee that since the Cal Library was bigger and more desirable as a resource for our faculty, that what we ought to do is to take advantage of it by financing a bus, which later became called the Gutenberg Express, which went back and forth across the bay between Stanford and Cal to the great advantage of all the Stanford people who could use it. Now the World Wide Web takes care of those kinds of problems, but we all recognized right up until the millennium started that we had all kinds of admiration at Stanford for what was going on at Cal, and we frequently emulated it. But today, the situation is a little different, and with disastrous consequences for our university here. Michigan, Wisconsin, Washington, Cal. There are iconic examples of the achievements of the decisions made in the land grant movement in the last millennium. It's a point I like to make that not one of these universities within the past year has made the U.S. News and World Report rating list. That's a point I make despite my disdain for the entire hapless example. The causes are legion, though. Part of the problem has to do with unfunded federal mandates. Some of it has to do with old Proposition 13. Some of it has to do with the more recent supermajority requirement for legislative tax increases. This is not a pretty situation, and it is certainly scheduled to get even worse. A few concluding points. These days, the significant problem that's stressing state budgets has to do with healthcare costs that are imposed on the states. For a recent period, the last years between 2008 and 2010, each percentage point increase in the share of a state's budget devoted to Medicaid caused higher education to be reduced by about 3%. That's relentless. State appropriations for higher education in relation to personal income have shifted in a troublesome direction. When Mike Heyman and I became presidents of these two universities in 1980, that rate was around $8.50 per $1,000 of personal income. It dropped to $7 in 2002 and to $6 last year. That's not the right direction. Some fine state research universities have in effect given up privatizing their own accounts by increasing out-of-state tuition revenues, often in graduate schools, before they go to move to undergraduate tuitions. Here at Cal, the university has been considering raising tuition, of course, reducing quality by limiting class availability, and by finding savings by holding down professorial salaries. A local example that I hesitate to offer because it will give you one even more legitimate reason for booing Stanford, that the average assistant professor at Stanford in 2000 earned 9% more than the average assistant professor at Cal. This year, that disparity rose to 17%. We might approach a solution by some policy adjustments to reduce healthcare costs, I suppose. If there's ever a political non-starter, that's probably it. A better approach surely would be the one taken by the governor in his recent letter to the citizens of this state and by the Think Long group to improve education support by taxing high earners, perhaps by a ballot resolution. I'm going to conclude quickly by saying that these are hard times for the unemployed, the underemployed, and those enrolled at or aspiring to the University of California. It's a real shame that this disparity should exist. And if people from elsewhere committed to the success of the great public universities could speak out more often and lend their support to make them better and to improve the budgets that fund them. I hope that as in the past, my Stanford colleagues will step up and rally for Cal. Allowing this disparity and this situation to continue to exist in a way strikes me as a failure to fulfill the promise of the Homestead Act, and it's something we ought to consider as a real obligation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Katherine, I think we have shown that we can do the impossible here. We had 5 academics speak in less than 40 minutes. We're all academics here. So it's time to move to question and answer, which I hope will be the most exciting part of this. We have encouraged our panelists to argue with each other. And before we do that, I want to make some acknowledgments. First of all, this person running around right here, Nora Paymer, has put in a huge amount of work, including designing these posters to make this event possible. And the other 3 deans who have been involved, besides myself, in creating the fora are Carla Hesse from Social Sciences, Jen Walk from the College of Environmental Design, and Keith Gillis from the College of Natural Resources. We also have been very grateful to have the assistance and the endorsement of a number of groups on campus, including the Office of the Chancellor, the Academic Senate, the Associated Students of the University of California, the Berkeley Staff Assembly, and the Graduate Assembly. So we appreciate their participation. And in that vein, I'm going to turn over the next phase of the program to Vishali Lumba, who is the president of the ASUC, and Philippe Marchand, who is representing the Graduate Assembly, and they're going to manage the question and answers.
Thank you. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to call up 2 or 3 people at a time, and you can just come up to one of the mics in the aisles, and we'll pass your question back to you, and you can ask it to the panelists. So we'll start out with Jenna Allen, Mark, and Milton Von Dam.
Hi, I'm Jenna Allen. I'm a staff member here at UC Berkeley. I appreciate Katherine's call to collaboration and creativity given the current environment. Is there more we, meaning the UC, can be doing to work with other higher education institutions in the state of California, the CSUs, the community colleges, to serve the state with less public money?
There we go. Yes, absolutely. I think there's definitely more that we can be doing. I think that question that I put in the talk about if we were to imagine a public higher education system for California from scratch at this moment, what would it look like? I think it's really important that that also be part of our process. We talk often about preservation, preserving our public character, and being stewards of what we've inherited, and I believe in all of those things. But I think so much has changed at this moment. I mean, the digital revolution is the biggest thing since Gutenberg, since the invention of the printing press. It's going to have enormous, it's already having enormous implications. And so for us to really reimagine what it would look like from scratch, of course, we won't be able to do that, you know, but I think important insights could come from that. And another thing I want to say about the master plan of higher education is we think of that document as representing public higher education in California, but very interestingly, the key team that made that plan was led by the president of Occidental College, and the provost from Stanford were part of that team. And even though they couldn't come up with anything mandated by the state about independent universities, they too were seen as part of the whole ecosystem. Does anyone else want to take that?
Well, I think we should get through as many questions as we can, unless somebody has a...
Okay. My name is Mark Grabner. I'm a PhD student in cell biology here. And my question is that, you know, we see maybe some advances in response to the student protests, but overall I'm worried that politicians are ignoring them and that what we are getting is lip service, not advancement. And if that is the case, what options do students have? Do you think a student strike would be effective, or is that just hurting ourselves and is something else that would fall on deaf ears?
Let me start with this. So I hear your concerns, and I enumerated at least 5 things I know that are going on. And I understand the anxiety for justice. I mean, it's been almost a month since what happened at Berkeley. But I guess from my perspective, as somebody who's decided, who's said he's been willing to work within the system, I'm willing to let the processes play out, those 5 commissions investigate, and see what comes of it. And if we don't get adequate justice, then I think taking student protests to the next level would be appropriate. That's just my recommendation. That's not necessarily how I would prescribe everybody else to deal with the situation. But I understand where your frustrations come, and I can speak for Jonathan here. We both feel it significantly as well.
And I want to point out that Speaker Perez, the Speaker of the California Assembly, has made unannounced visits to Davis and to UC Berkeley, and later this week is holding a forum, a private gathering with UC student leaders in Los Angeles. Governor Brown recently spoke out about it. There's a investigation into police actions on the UC that's currently being led by the legislature. I think that I mean, it's difficult to know now if what we're getting is lip service. We'll know when the budget process is completed in January through June of 2012. But there is an interest and an attention being paid by the media, by the public, and by the legislature that I think is unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. And I want to point out that, Alfredo and I are in a lot of meetings with regents where they say, why do the students protest on campus? It just seems so misdirected. Why don't they protest in Sacramento? That's where the issue is. And while I agree that it's important to protest in Sacramento, and we've joined students on the steps of the Capitol and will continue to do so at future events, without the Occupy actions that have happened at both Berkeley, Davis, and then also at other UCs, I think other students at other UCs are working really, really hard. They just get less attention. We wouldn't have this really intense interest statewide in what's going on at the UC right now and what the problems facing public higher education. So I think that things like strikes to this point have contributed to the attention we're getting. I think that we're at least getting some response from state legislators, and I think future actions of that kind are necessary.
Let me just add that I do think that the actions on the campuses have had an impact that have been useful in changing the conversation. But I ran large demonstrations in the late 60s and early 70s, and then I was demonstrating against Dick Nixon and Spiro Agnew. And I think it's really important to remember who you are demonstrating against. I don't think Bob Bergeneau and George Breslau are Dick Nixon and Spiro Agnew, just to maybe state the obvious, but I think once in a while maybe the obvious needs stating. These are 2 men who are devoted to public higher education. They care deeply and profoundly about the mission of this university. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't have demonstrations on the Cal campus, but I think people should think about who are you demonstrating against and what are you trying to achieve.
Well, does anyone have anything to say about the past effectiveness of student strikes, not just protests?
You mean historically, or
yeah.
going way back? I don't know that I have a historical perspective on that, not knowing enough.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I could tell them a few stories about that. My name is Milton Von Dam. I was a lobbyist for the university's budget between the mid-'60s and the end of the '70s, where that curve was going up. Not because of me necessarily, but
job well done.
We need you working for us again.
If I could just give a little preface to my question, it'll give it a better context. When I was lobbying for the university, I found it very important not only to define the university and keep the benefits at the forefront of people's minds and remind them how great the university is, but also to step back and give a larger perspective of how this great research university can help the state solve its problems from its point of view in a non-political way. And this is why I wrote this question. What is this great research university doing to help the state and local governments to define viable tax reform and promote efficiency and perhaps creative ways of making governmental agencies modify how they do what they do?
Well, as the Dean of the Public Policy School, I can say we're doing quite a bit. Our students are quite involved through various projects, what we call our introductory policy analysis projects. through summer internships and then through their master's essays, which we call the APA, to do projects with state and local governments. We've also done things such as, and this was initiated by the students, although the rest of the school had a lot to do with it, an event about a month ago where Assembly Speaker John Perez was the keynote speaker, and it was on financing California, and it dealt with issues such as the realignment process to try to improve criminal justice system in the state, the K through 12 and higher education system, and how you could better get linkages between K through 12 and the higher education system to do a better job of getting students through the whole process, higher completion rates, for example, and another session on the new budget process because of the new just majority requirement instead of supermajority requirement. So we're trying through those kinds of things, and I know the campus across the board is trying to do a lot of things with state and local governments, and everything from energy to social services to education, you name it.
I think that's terrific. I think that will contribute to the legislative bodies realizing that in a practical sense, the university is indispensable. Thank you.
I agree.
Can I make just a quick point about the question that preceded this one? I do think in part we have to pay some attention to the fact that there are other states and other great public institutions that have exactly the same problem economically that this university has, that it's important to go to Sacramento, but there's also importance to build a kind of national movement that really benefits Wisconsin and Michigan as much as it benefits those who care about the University of California. There are groups of people who are graduate students in these various research universities who you mentioned have started to organize in that regard. I think that kind of effort would have a significant impact not only nationally but on the state level in several places.
So the next set of questions is going to be from Barry Thorne, Bahar Nawab, Donald Riley, and Susan Hoffman. And while the speakers are coming to the mic, I want to mention on the student strike question that I think you have to look at other parts of the world. There's been many places where student strike have been more common than in the US, and I think you can look at, I think all these tactics only matter of how well they're organized, how good your message is, and also how many people you have to put economic pressure. And I think a student strike can put economic pressure, and you can even get, chambers of commerce to be on your side if, you're really saying like, well, you're going to lose people that are going to have these highly qualified jobs. So in any case, I'm going to move to the speaker.
My question was actually about the handling of campus violence, which we've already discussed a little. I'd like to address Henry Brady specifically about this because of your response that Bergeneau and Breslauer didn't cause the problem of disinvestment in public education. We all know that's true. And we all know they would desperately want to turn things around. They're on our side in that regard. But their mishandling of campus protest and their failure to defend free speech is a serious obstacle to mobilizing and to getting back to the addressing of the issues at hand. It's quite a serious diversion. So I'd like to ask you about that problem that we're in right now. We are in a crisis at the moment. Could the administration do more to defend free speech and to end the problem of the use of excessive violence against nonviolent protest?
We can always do better, and I think this administration absolutely wants to do better. At the same time, let me talk again about when I ran large demonstrations in the late 60s, early 70s. One of the things I worried about most of all was that there were people who would gravitate to such demonstrations, and their goal would be to create violence and problems. And I think one of the problems that any administrator has, anybody running a demonstration has, is trying to make sure that doesn't happen, that things don't get out of control. So that administrators must not only defend free speech, they must not only make sure there's no violence, and let's face it, we're all appalled at the video we saw of what happened on Sproul Plaza. Nobody wants that to happen. At the same time, they have to balance with that the need to make sure that this is a safe campus and that people can feel that they can go to their classes and do their work in safety. And so that's the kind of balance that has to occur. And I've heard very little statement or discussion about that second problem. It's all about free speech, which of course is important, but there's other values that have to be protected as well. And I think we need to make sure that we understand the importance of those values as well.
If I could just respond to say there is no video evidence of violence on November 9th. No stones were thrown. It was preemptive use of batons, and they beat up the poet laureate of the United States.
I need to speak on this. I mean, this is, it's a hard place for our institution to be. And the discussion about what is violence, what is nonviolence, prompted me to kind of go deeper into my own research. Though I write on South Africa, and there's been a long tradition of nonviolent as well as violent protest in South Africa, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is its own model of what a community needs to do in the aftermath of violence. I do feel a resonance here that our fabric has been torn and there is need for repair, and that so far is not happening. Perhaps the conversation we're having right now is a beginning. When I searched the word nonviolence on Google after Wikipedia, about 4 hits down was a place called the Meta Center. The Meta Center was founded by Professor Emeritus of Berkeley, Michael Nagler. We are a leading center for nonviolence, for thinking about nonviolence. And I went to Petaluma on Saturday and had lunch with him to talk about what the Meta Center might be able to do to help us to cultivate a knowledge, at the very least, a knowledge about the history of nonviolence and perhaps a practice, a much more disciplined practice within the administration, among the faculty, among the students, and they would love to be involved in that. We just need to extend the invitation. And yet this is just another example of, I think, how often we don't use the university. We don't use our own resources to address our own problems. We hire outside people, we hire consultants. Let's use the university. We have tremendous riches here. Thank you.
I want to add, Dean Brady, I also sort of want to push back respectively that there's, I think, an admirable commitment to nonviolence on the part of students who have taken part in the most recent round of protests. And as of now, the only evidence of violence thus far is from the police. I think it's something that needs to be acknowledged, right? And I understand the interest in protecting public safety, but you take a look at UC Davis and the pepper spray incident, and there's just no, it's just impossible for me to understand what police were thinking in that instance, right? There is no concern about public safety that justifies the behavior of the police in those instances. But I want to sort of respond to the question and sort of push back in this weird, counterintuitive way. I understand that police violence against students has distracted from the core issue of funding for public higher education, but it actually has the strange effect of doubling or tripling or quadrupling interest and presence and frustration. And when cops pepper sprayed 10 students at Davis, they turned out hundreds of students the next day because of that action, and then thousands of students the next week in a massive rally. That was in part about responding to police violence and free speech and the right to protest, but was also about funding for public higher education. And I think that the university and its students have done a relatively admirable job, actually, of making our response to police violence sort of an urgent and pressing matter while simultaneously making sure that the core issues that drove people out to protest in the first place, cuts to higher education, the public nature of higher education in California, hasn't been lost, and we've actually been able to sort of take advantage. I know that we can do a better job, and I've been pushing some of our administrators to try to sort of capitalize on this moment and make sure that the core message is not lost. I think that we've actually been, maybe it's just pure dumb luck, but we've done okay. So.
Also, just want to mention before giving the mic to Bauer that we have also on the list of speakers Donald Riley and Susan Hoffman. So if you are in the room, please. Oh, okay. So you'll be next, and please send more questions. Please send more questions. We probably will have time for more.
Hi, I'm Bahar Nawab. I'm a PhD student in health policy and also the president for the Graduate Assembly here. Thank you for being here. I had a quick, I guess not a quick question, but if students don't want to see their tuition go up and taxpayers don't want to pay more taxes, is it time that we start looking at other education models or other hybrid models that we can institute here in California and be that leader again? Like, should we be looking to Australia's model where you don't pay tuition, you don't pay upfront, and then you pay taxes based on your, the career, and so it becomes you pay proportionate to what you're making. And if you do think we should be having those conversations, then whose responsibility is it to lead that effort? Because students, we're tired of being told, you students go do this, you go to Sacramento, so whose responsibility is that?
Good question. I think that plan, that idea that your lifetime income would be, well, actually not lifetime, but maybe 20 years, you would pay a fraction of your income, and that would, no matter what your total costs were, the total loans you got, or however you want to think about it, in the end, after 20 years, after paying a certain fraction of your income, you'd be finished. That would be a great plan. The only way it's really going to work is if at least the state government decides to do it, because the administrative costs are so high unless you have some political authority like the Franchise Tax Board or hopefully eventually the IRS that did this kind of thing that could keep track of the money and make sure it's done properly. But that's a great idea. Whose job is it? Well, on Friday I was at a session where actually Chancellor Bergeno put forth a program that he's been concocting that goes back to an op-ed that he and Frank Yeary put out about 2 years ago about federal funding for higher education, and they've now refined it, and I think it's a very interesting proposal, and they have been pushing to try to get various universities around the country to adopt this idea, which would help provide federal money for campuses that would be matched by private donors, and it's sort of complex, but it's a neat way to think about getting more federal money into higher education. But your idea as well, I think, is something that groups should get behind. Jonathan?
Yeah, Alfredo? Yeah, if I can speak to that. I know you didn't want it to come from students, but actually that very idea has come from a group of students at UC Riverside that you may have heard about already. And, sometimes when you hear students speak at the state capitol or regents meetings, they are demanding, that the current leaders make certain decisions for them. And I always push back on that. I think those of us who are students now should not feel that our time for leadership is later. We should feel that we can be leaders now in the positions that we find ourselves in. So, and oftentimes it's only people who have the real passion to change things that will take on big problems like this. So, Jonathan and I have been working with the students at UC Riverside to potentially bring this up at the January Regents meeting, what happens to be at Riverside. Jonathan maybe can speak a little bit more to like how ready it is for bringing it to the public, but this precise idea is something that's come across our desk and something we're working on.
I won't provide additional details because they're trying to keep it quiet for now.
I'm bad with secrets.
Shh, everybody. Don't tell.
But the larger point, I think, is still valid, which is that, Bahar, students in that specific instance were sort of tired of waiting for creative ideas from other people and said, we're just going to go ahead and do this ourselves, and are making impressive progress.
I'd like to extend an invitation to anyone who's feeling that they have an idea that they would like to prototype together with Clark Kellogg, I think might still be in the back there, and Sarah Beckman. We are running a Townsend Center working group called Making UC Futures. So if you just search Making UC Futures, you'll find us. You can become a member. And we have, we've conceived of this as an incubation space for new ideas, for looking at new models, new prototypes. It's one of the things we tend to lack in public higher education. Something really great was designed, and we've just kind of been riding that out and making it good. But we're at a moment where we're being asked as an institution to do something that our organization isn't really set up to do. But fortunately, right across the Bay in the Silicon Valley, we have a lot of models of how startups happen, about how new ideas, they're actually methodologies, they're practices for prototyping the future, and our goal is to bring some of those practices to the University of California.
And if I can speak to that just a bit, I had the opportunity to work in the state legislature 2 years ago and staffed my then boss, Assemblymember Portantino, on the 50-year anniversary of the master plan. And I think it just strengthens the point I made earlier. If we wait for the so-called leaders to make the decisions for us, we're going to be waiting a long time, because going over this plan after 50 years of it being successful, the stuff that they came out with as a committee was so working on the margins that it was almost not worthless, but it was questionable the value that the commission had. Anyways, so I'm happy to hear that the Making UC Futures group is working, and I'm also just want to say we need to take ownership of our own leadership and hopefully not wait for other people to make change for us.
So Katherine, can I ask you to elaborate just 1 second, because as Alfredo and I did this fall tour of all the campuses, and I anticipate the same will happen when we do a spring tour of all the campuses, students would come to us and say, I have this idea for how we could build a new master plan. I have this idea that would radically change the way the UC is funded. And it's embryonic. I don't have the resources. I'm an undergraduate student. I don't know how to turn this into a reality. Can they go to you and get help, get resources, and flesh out of the box ideas?
I mean, we would love to have people come to us with
this
ideas.
This is fabulous. I'm so happy
we would love,
exists.
and so it's an unlikely group of faculty who are running it. So here I am in the arts, and Clark is from the College of Environmental Design, and Sarah is from the Haas School of Business. These are unlikely disciplines to be collaborating, but each of us in our own way have practices for incubating and prototyping, and sometimes it needs to be a space where people can fail. Yeah. It needs to, I mean, that's how we've conceived of this space. We don't have a lot of resources, but we have, sometimes you just need ideas to start with.
MakingUCFutures.com?
No, it's through the Townsend Center. It's a longer URL, but if you put Making UC Futures into Google, you'll find us. It's through the Townsend Humanities Center.
Hello, over here.
Hello.
Okay. My name is Susan Hoffman. I'm the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at UC Berkeley. And you have just now, in a wonderful way, been addressing what my set of questions were going to be, which was to sort of talk more about the taxation possibilities, the revenue generating ideas, and also to raise the question around the leadership at all the levels. And I guess partly just for our own information for the students, if you can tell us if in fact in the trustees, in the Board of Regents meetings, and with conversations you've had with chancellors, are you at all hopeful that there will be some leadership on their part around supporting this week's Governor Brown's tax proposals, which you've just mentioned? I mean, are we going to see any leadership among our UC leaders?
I'll handle this, and I'm going to try to be cautious because I have strong feelings on this. My guess is no, because there are not explicit revenues set aside in Governor Brown's proposals for UC and higher education. And last year, when we had the proposed tax extensions that the governor wanted the Board of Regents to formally endorse, President Yudof, and from my understanding, at the behest of some board members who were not anxious to support tax extensions, said unless it's explicitly to fund the UC, then the Board of Regents will not officially endorse it. With that said, though, we do have some pretty influential members on the board who have incredible working knowledge of the state government and have served in the state government themselves. So, I would prefer, I believe Jonathan would prefer, and probably everybody up here, that the Board of Regents were leaders on this and did, push for more revenue wherever it comes from. However, oftentimes in a high-pressure environment like that, a lot of members feel more comfortable doing it without public fanfare. So So that's my take.
I understand, and what I fear is that public opinion sets UC ends up looking more elitist, that we're not kind of supporting what is in the public good. I know for a decade I represented the arts in Sacramento and Washington and was asked all the time by lawmakers, how do you expect us to increase money for arts and culture? Where does it come from? And so Lenny Goldberg always had many good ideas, who I'm certain many of you have talked to. I think he was last at the Townsend Center. There's no end to good ideas. It's really a question about political will, I think. And those good ideas, will get their day.
I just want to add that in addition to looking elitist, if you have a broadly supported revenue-raising measure on the 2012 ballot, and the environmental community gets behind it, and the K-12 community gets behind it, and the health access and community organizers get behind it, and the arts community gets behind it, and the UC stands apart and says, we can't support this unless there's an explicit set-aside of revenues for the UC, we don't look like we're team players. And we can never hope to engage in a broad-based coalition of progressive groups, or frankly, any groups, on behalf of a more robust public finance that invests in public priorities. It's in my view, a huge problem.
I will say, though, and this is kind of in jest, but from my experience serving as a regent and being kind of quiet about that because I get a bad response sometimes, I don't know if the regent's support is something that would win the public over. I mean, the regents are oftentimes one of the most hated groups I've ever come across, and it might be good for the regents to come out against it because people will be like, oh, we don't want to do what they want to do. So kind of in jest, but kind of serious.
My name's Donald Riley. I'm a retired professor in the psychology department many long years ago. And the question I had has evolved as I've been listening to this, but basically the question is the whole issue of how we influence a climate of opinion and ideology in Sacramento. And I was struck by what Mr. Stein had to say about using retail politics and using students to go back to their home districts and influence parents and other people in their home districts. And I wonder, is that actually happening? Is there a group that's organizing to do this? Or is this a nice idea that you think should be pursued? I'm interested in what any of you think about the whole idea, but the retail politics strikes me as an exciting notion.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I think it's important is because, to quibble briefly with the 99%, 1% dichotomy sort of structure that's being used, in my view, the problem, while I think that's useful and it's a useful frame, the problem is the very substantial percentage of Californians who do not make 1% salaries who are unwilling to tax the 1%. That is to say, we have a very substantial number of Californians who make middle-class incomes who are uncomfortable taxing people who make over $500,000 a year. And if we could win those people over, we wouldn't need to change perceptions in the 1%. It would be irrelevant. We would tax them against their own will. And so that's why I think retail politics are important. If you live in Visalia, or you live in Merced, or you live in Stockton, your parents are hugely important. They're voters in a conservative district, and they're just as important as 1%ers. Right now, I mean, there is no concerted effort to send Berkeley students home to their parents to advocate for the UC, though I'm going to work with you two and work with the ASUC and the GA to make sure that we can get that message out as best we can. We're currently trying to write a letter, and because of finals, this is just sort of stalled out, but write a letter co-signed by UC students and by the Faculty Association, the Faculty Senate here, and send it to every living UC Berkeley alumni under the assumption that there is no time in recent history where alumni are more interested in hearing from students and from faculty about what's going on campus. And that's sort of in the drafting process, but the problem is, we're all full-time students and are trying to do this advocacy as best we can while passing classes. So we're working on it.
This, retail politics idea of having students talk to their families, this is an idea that's been percolating now for several years, and it's just so obvious that we should be doing this. This should be led by the Office of the President. It should be led by the chancellors on each campus. They have the infrastructure to make this happen, and it should happen across all 3 tiers of higher education, because in terms of actual numbers, the UC student population is so tiny compared to the CSUs and the community colleges. But if you add up all the students enrolled in those 3 tiers and you give a kit to each one of those students to go talk to their families, their parents, their neighbors, that is a very significant part of the proportion of the California population. That is a very significant part.
There are some political action committees that have been set up by the alumni to try to do some of these kinds of things. And so there are some actions afoot to try to proceed in this direction.
Hi, I didn't give you a card. It's okay. I actually wrote a question or a comment on the internet before the first one of these forums, and it never got responded. So let me tell you what it was. I assume that the main topic at these fora will be how to get the public to send more money to higher ed and to UC. And that's what it's been all about, and I'm totally in favor of that. But I think we need to do something more, something that is a bit more internal, something that is a bit more contentious, but that ties into the question of public attitudes toward UC. For example, internal reforms at the top. These are topics for which I'm really now speaking to the deans who organized this. The turnouts have been pretty modest. If you were to set up debates between well-informed, articulate people who had passionate feelings in contrast on top issues, like should we democratize the Board of Regents? Should we tell the truth about how this university spends the money it takes from students as their tuition, etc. I think it would be much more interesting to get more people in, and I think it would be much more interesting to get messages out. Thank you. My name is Schwartz. I'm from the physics department.
Well, speaking of the deans, I mean, this is part of our point here, is to have a discussion among various points of view. I think we have a pretty broad range of viewpoints here on this particular panel, and we've certainly tried to make sure that we do. And I think the idea of going forward and dealing with particular topics, like you say, that might be useful, and it's something that we should consider.
We have a couple more questions. And again, if any of this conversation or discussion spark questions, please write them down. We have more note cards for you and send them up. Michael Deere, Nick Robinson, Paul Schwatschow, and Howard Fields. Are any of you still there?
So hi, I'm Howard Fields, and I'm a professor in neurology at UC San Francisco. I run a research lab that was made possible by the university, and I think my questions have pretty much been answered, but I did want to make a comment about the other side, if you will, thinking, maybe picking up from Katherine Cole and using my imagination. The tax problem in California did not appear out of the blue. There's a well-organized and well-financed anti-tax movement in this country. Not sure where all the money is coming from, but my imagination could run wild. And these forces are persistent and relentless and almost never confronted. It seems to me that something that Jonathan was talking about, and Henry called his attention to this, what's going on in the university is a reflection of what's going on in society at large. We're a symptom of a disease. We're not the disease. If anything, the university is a place where the healthy practices can begin. It will take concerted effort by everybody, the students, the staff, the faculty. And that will be to call attention to what the university actually represents. It's a safeguard for our culture, both the private and the public universities. It's where protest has to be encouraged and protected, because it's one of the purposes of the university is to have these ideas out there. But my challenge to the students is, yeah, we're all busy. We all have too much to do. But this is a crisis. And it does call for organization across all the higher education levels. I think there's so many people that it would be a force to be reckoned with. Equal in power, for example, to the Union of the Prison Guards, which has a huge impact on California's budget, to the point where the prison budget is now exceeding that of the University of California. These are things that can be called to public attention, and I think the time is right. I'm very optimistic, and I want to thank you all for coming here to help protect this place.
Okay, so we'll continue taking questions. So if anyone has additional questions, please come up. We have some anonymous questions that I'll read out. What, if any, interest or obligation do private research universities have for public universities?
I'm going to turn to you for that one.
Well, I think there's been a little too much silence from the well-endowed private sector, and I think it's time for it to change. That's one of the reasons that I came up here. I think there are common strengths, obviously, to both. But when the Stanfords and the Harvards see a significant diminution in what is being accomplished or offered to students at the University of California or the University of Washington or the University of Wisconsin, they ought to be part of the message that goes to those voters and to their representatives, either in state legislatures or their representatives in Congress. I do think that a little more attention ought to be given to national lobbying, that is Washington-focused lobbying, because a lot of policies that are going to impact this are going to influence state policies and so forth. So those representatives who are taking important federal positions need to know what impacts they may have around the corner on states. I mean, we talked a little bit this morning about unfunded federal liabilities, and that certainly is worth some attention at the state level.
Let me just say, too, and first of all, just thank Don Kennedy for coming over here, which I just thought it was wonderful. This is a man bites dog story when the Stanford President Emeritus comes over and says we're being treated badly, and I really appreciate that. If nothing else, it's a great morale booster. But it's also, I think, important for the private universities to remember that they have a substantial amount of funding from the public sector. On the student side, student loans and Pell Grants. On the research side, all the federal research funding. On the philanthropic side, all the tax breaks that they get. And sure, right now it's the public universities which are hurting the most, but I would think that unless we make the case and we make it together for why universities are important, why it's important to educate people as best we can, why it's important to do the kind of research we do, unless we work together to make that case, then I think the privates will eventually find that they also are under attack for some of the things they get, like philanthropic breaks with respect to the tax code, or cuts in federal research funding, or whatever. And so I think common cause would make a lot of sense.
I have a question for Professor Kennedy, if I may. I mean, aren't the incentives for private universities all in the wrong direction? That is to say, why would they join us in advocating for public universities when decreased funding for public universities presumably makes it easier for the Stanfords of the world and the USCs of the world to snatch our top graduate students or our top faculty and so on, right? I mean, how do you combat the fact that the incentives would encourage inaction from them on the question of divestment in public higher education?
Well, there's another one of those suburban myths that used to be around that Stanford and the University of California had a deal going that, that we got to do all the private fundraising that we wanted to do, and Cal would kind of stay out of it. But in fact, all over the place, that argument didn't carry any weight at all. The reason is that there's no evidence whatever that the philanthropic pie is unsubdividable. I mean, the fact is that both sides grow and have always grown since the public universities started fundraising. The private universities ought to be cheering as public universities start doing that and helping if necessary. There's no evidence that it's an interference or that it's against the private university's interest.
So I'm going to call Connor Jackson to the mic, and in the meantime, I'm going to ask a question from a student who probably left. Professor Brady, you've presented data that shows that wealthier, more highly educated, older people choose to secure their own privileges rather than invest in the future of higher education. The UC Regents are older and wealthier and maybe more highly educated. Can they be trusted to govern for the benefit of the weak?
Oh gosh. Let's see. I work for the Regents. How can I get out of this one?
I can speak to that.
I really don't want to sit here and defend the Regents in every way. I mean, I think there are actually honest questions that have to be asked about the governance in the long run of the University of California. So let me just do what a politician does, which is answer a different question, which is that we should be thinking about, does it make sense, in fact, to have the governance structure we now have when so little of our funding comes from the state? To what extent should we find ways to have more people represented on the Board of Regents, more interests represented, more ways of making sure that we have accountability?
More students.
Thank you.
And a faculty member.
All interests have been heard from.
It's worth noting that given that students now contribute more to the UC than the state of California, students have increasingly noted that it's completely and utterly preposterous that there's one voting student regent and 25 that can in some way draw a connection to the state government, either appointed by the governor or ex officio members elected officials,
well,
correct?
not the two alumni regents.
Right, so 23? Okay, so that seems like an imbalance in my view. And there's a student campaign being led by the statewide student government to try to increase the student representation on the board.
Jonathan and I are willing to trade at 2 gubernatorial regents, appointed regents for 1 more student regent.
We're in.
That's kind of a joke.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Connor Jackson. I'm a freshman engineering physics major here. I'm from Pennsylvania, so other than standing out on Sproul and making noise, what can I do?
Maybe withhold the fact that you're from Pennsylvania? No, I think Jonathan, I mean, when Jonathan talks about doing what you're comfortable with, I mean, you don't have to lead a lobby visit with, I'm from Pennsylvania. You can say, I live in Berkeley. So, you know, I don't know if you've re-registered to vote here, but if you have, then you have just as much a say over what happens in California as any of us do. So don't let where you were born, where you were raised, prevent you from feeling that you can speak out on behalf of yourself as a Californian now.
And isn't the larger story, the national story, that we've lost a sense, we've lost a clarity about the public good and what public services mean, and you know, so that's the larger topic that all of us can address.
Yeah, I think that is the topic. I mean, what happened with the Reagan Revolution is that Ronald Reagan convinced people that taxes really were misspent and weren't helping to solve problems. And that case just has to be made, and it has to be made again and again and again. The truth is, public money can, I run a public policy school, so obviously I believe this, but it's just so obviously true to me, it's hard for me to believe that people don't. And in fact, let me just tell a story about somebody who I was talking to who was a potential donor. And I was sitting near the Rose Bowl before a UCLA game, and this person was saying, you know, government can never solve problems. The private sector really solves all the problems we have. And I looked up, and it was a beautiful, magnificent day in Los Angeles. I said, gee, it's a beautiful day, as if I were changing the subject. And he said, yeah, it's a beautiful day. And I said, I wonder how it got that way. I remember there used to be a lot of smog all the time in the LA basin. And it's just that those simple kinds of conversations don't seem to be occurring, where people are reminded that the smog just didn't get up and go one day. It's because government stepped in and regulated air pollution, and now we have a much better place to live in Los Angeles than it was when I was a kid in the 60s.
I think if you're from Pennsylvania, it'd be a great idea to talk about your representative of the congressional district in which you live and tell them what a terrific experience you had at the University of California. You might, well, full stop on that topic. In response to what my colleague, the dean, just said, a great way of reminding yourself about the fact that you didn't actually do it all alone is to listen to Elizabeth Warren talk about how nobody actually does it all alone in this society.
I'm gonna call up Brian Alvarez, and then in the meantime, this was a question submitted online. It seems clear that Prop 13 is a huge problem in our state for funding public education. How can we unite as a university and use our powerful say in removing this piece of legislation?
Prop 13.
Prop 13.
Oh. The one thing that looks most vulnerable on Prop 13 is to go to split rolls. What Prop 13 did, among other things, did a lot of things, like the 2/3 rule for taxes. That's probably unassailable given the public opinion data. The people in the state of California love that rule. They also love the fact that their taxes on homes stay low once they've bought their home. Of course, what happens is when they buy their home, tax base goes up because of the new cost for that home. What happens on the commercial side, unfortunately, is that commercial firms have found a way to never turn over that commercial real estate. So whereas when Prop 13 was passed, about 50% of the property taxes came from commercial real estate and 50% from residential. It's now 70% residential and 30% commercial, because commercial firms have found a way not to turn over their property and therefore not to be subject to the revaluation provision. Split rolls would say, let's split these two things apart and let's now actually increase taxes on commercial real estate in a different way than we do on residential real estate. That looks like it's a doable thing. And the mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, has been pushing that idea and others as well.
Hi. So I'm Brian Alvarez. I'm a grad student in psychology. And I'll ask you this question and actually have an answer too, because I've been asking a lot of students and faculty and everyone. But just what you see as the most timely unmet needs that will improve the quality of the educational experience at UC Berkeley and even education in general.
Well, I actually think that we should be spending a lot more time as professors thinking about improving the quality of classroom experience for people. There's a lot that's been learned now about how to teach better, and I think we could even be spending more time on reviewing ourselves, that is to say peer review. We do peer review of research all the time. We should be doing peer review of teaching, and we should be working with one another to improve our teaching. I think if we did that, the experience for students could be markedly improved, and that without us having to work harder. In other words, I'm not asking that faculty members start teaching more classes. I'm saying let's just do it better. And the truth is, too few of us have ever had a chance to discuss our teaching, to have others observe our teaching, and to try to improve our teaching.
Recently, the president of Wesleyan, Michael Roth, was visiting the campus, and I just had a moment informally with him beforehand and said, somehow we got talking about fundraising, and I said, how do you feel about doing all that? Because we're not really trained to do that as academics. And he said, well, we're not really trained to teach either. I think we've gotten a little bit better on this front since when I was in graduate school, but I think we could do a lot better just overall nationally across all sectors, public and private, on that front. I'm also struck reading about both the 1960 Master Plan of higher education and then Clark Kerr's book, The Uses of the University, the first 3 chapters of which were written in 1963. That book in some ways is almost a blueprint for what he called the multiversity, and we are the quintessential multiversity. And it's just very clear in that text that in that new formulation of a research university that met mass education, students lost. He was aware that they lost, and he wrote about that descriptively rather than proscriptively in those Godkin lectures. And it was those lectures that fueled Mario Savio and the free speech movement, I think often people not hearing each other through the bullhorns. But I think to go back to that moment and say, students really lost in that formulation, and that's structural. It might be that the recurrence of violence that we've had over 50 years is not unrelated to a structural flaw in the institution. I think about this a little bit like my house here, which is 100 years old, and when we bought it, the foundation was crumbling. And what we learned is that foundations in Berkeley were often poured using sand from the bay. That works fine for a while, but there's salt in that foundation, and over time it makes it crumble. And I feel like we have some salt in our foundation, and particularly around students.
Well, do you want to say, I just want to hear, you said you've talked to students. I'd like to hear your perspective.
Yeah, same here.
So I got into this through kind of my unique circumstance here, but I've been talking to everyone. So it's students, staff, faculty, and admin. I've written down 4 of these things, and feedback, I would say, being able to rate teachers and things like that, and just teaching in general is a big one. But so one thing that students have been asking for when you talk about education, it's not just learning the tools and trades, but it's getting, I guess, the tools and the time and the support and the space to be able to have emphasis on introspection, on self-reflection, and on self-definition. So the question I like to ask students is, well, why'd you come to school? And they say, oh, Berkeley's an amazing place. And it's like, no, why'd you go to school? And no one has any clue. They don't know. They don't know why they're here. They say, well, it's my parents made me, or that's what everyone's doing. And then it's, what do you want to do? And it's like, I don't know. I'm not declared. I have no idea. No one knows about the career library on campus that helps you figure out who you are and what you want to do. So emphasis on that was a huge one for students. There's 3 more quick ones. One was hands-on applied learning through interdisciplinary collaboration. I know the Townsend Lab has been working on this to try and promote more interdisciplinary work. A big one was more dignified guidance and mentorship, and even communication between the ranks. So between faculty and students, the faculty say they don't have time to prioritize students. The students say they're actually too afraid to talk to faculty. It would be nice if the regents could sit down with a group of students in a room, open and say, like, let's have a discussion, let's meet for coffee, things like that, as opposed to always these really formal boundaries which create a lot of tension. And more meaningful feedback was the last one. So grades give you something, but they don't really give you a sense of who you are, or how you progressed. It's just, well, I got this versus this. So those were 4. Yeah.
May I speak to that real quick, Jonathan?
Yeah, go ahead.
So those are all fantastic suggestions. I really appreciate that. I can speak specifically to the one about regents talking to students. At the last regents meeting, the chairperson of the board, Sherry Lansing, asked if I would help organize the groups of students to meet with her at each of our 10 campuses. Jonathan and I have pushed aggressively to make sure regents know what it's like to be an actual student now. It's one thing to talk about what it was like when you were a student, however many years ago. It's a completely different thing to talk about what it's like to be a student at the moment. So with that, I'd like to stay in contact with you, Brian. I'd like maybe you could join the group when Sherry comes to Berkeley.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off now because we're about to overstay our welcome in Wheeler Hall. I want to thank all the speakers who have given us some remarkable points of view and eloquence here, and the questioners and all of you who have come in the audience. I think, although we didn't have the numbers we wanted here today, we certainly had the kind of dialogue and exchange and educational experience that we were all looking for. And last thing I want to say is, listening to Alfredo and Jonathan and Vishali and Philippe, if the students are paying twice as much as the state for this institution, let's put a few more people like that on the regents. Thank you all very much.